Louis Zamperini's life began in defiance, and it would continue that way until the very end. Born in 1917 to Italian immigrants in Olean, New York, he arrived in this world as the second son of Anthony and Louise Zamperini, a family that carried the hopes and hardships of the old country into the promise of the new. When Louis was barely 2 years old, his family moved west to Torrance, California, a small town south of Los Angeles where the Pacific breeze carried the scent of possibility. But young Louis brought something else with him, something his parents could not have anticipated. He brought chaos. He was not a bad child in the way we might think of cruelty or malice. He was simply ungovernable. The boy could not sit still, could not follow rules, could not resist the magnetic pull of mischief. He stole pies cooling on windowsills. He broke into the local high school and ransacked the gymnasium. He picked locks with the ease of a seasoned criminal, slipping into neighbors' homes not for profit but for the sheer thrill of it. His father, a stern man who had crossed an ocean to give his children a better life, tried discipline. The belt came out more than once. His mother, a devout Catholic, tried prayer. She lit candles and begged the saints to intervene. Nothing worked. The Italian boy with the dark, mischievous eyes was becoming well known to the Torrance police, and the trajectory of his young life seemed to be pointing in only one direction. Then his older brother, Pete, looked at Louis and saw something that no one else had noticed. Pete saw that the same energy that made Louis run from the police could be channeled into something else entirely. That speed, that absolute refusal to give up when someone was chasing him, that stubbornness that made him fight even when fighting was pointless. All of it could be transformed. Pete convinced their parents to let him take Louis to the high school track. More accurately, Pete dragged him there. And on that cinder track, under the California sun, Pete told his younger brother something that would echo through every moment of agony that lay ahead, words that would become the foundation upon which Louis would build an impossible survival. If you can take it, you can make it. Louis ran. And when he ran, something extraordinary happened. The noise in his head went quiet. The restlessness that had plagued him since childhood found its outlet. He was not the troublemaker anymore, not the disappointment, not the boy who made his mother weep. When he ran, he was free. He discovered that he could endure pain that made other boys quit. He could push his body past the point where his lungs screamed and his legs turned to lead. He could take it. And so he made it. By the time Louis Zamperini was 19 years old, he had become the fastest high school miler in American history. He ran the mile in 4 minutes and 21 seconds, a time that seemed almost impossible for a teenager. Newspapers called him the Torrance Tornado. Scouts came to watch him race. And in 1936, he qualified for the United States Olympic team. He was going to Berlin. He was going to run in front of Adolf Hitler himself, in a stadium built to showcase the supposed superiority of the Aryan race. Louis Zamperini, the son of Italian immigrants, the former juvenile delinquent, would represent his country on the grandest stage in the world. Berlin in 1936 was a city transformed by Nazi ideology into a temple of propaganda. Swastika flags hung from every building. Stormtroopers marched in perfect formation. Hitler sat in his box seat, watching each event with the intensity of a man who believed. These games proved something essential about human hierarchy. Jesse Owens, the African-American sprinter, had already begun to dismantle Hitler's racial theories by winning gold medals with a grace and power that transcended politics. And now it was Louis' turn to run in the 5,000 meters. He did not win. He finished 8th, and for most athletes, that would have been the end of the story. But something happened in that race that caught everyone's attention. On the final lap, with his body exhausted and his chances at a medal already gone, Louis unleashed a finishing kick that was simply ferocious. He ran that last lap in 56 seconds, the fastest final lap anyone had ever recorded at that distance. The German crowd, despite their indoctrination, rose to their feet and cheered. Adolf Hitler asked to meet him. Louis shook hands with the dictator, looked into those cold eyes, and later that night, in an act of youthful audacity that perfectly captured his spirit, he stole a Nazi flag from outside the Reich Chancellery as a souvenir. He returned home a hero. The Olympics of 1940 were scheduled for Tokyo. And everyone knew that Louis Zamperini would be at his absolute peak. He would be 23 years old, fully mature as a runner, with 4 more years of training ahead of him. Gold was not just possible. It was expected. Louis believed it himself. He trained harder than ever before. He dreamed of that moment, when he would stand on the podium and hear the national anthem while a gold medal hung around his neck. The future was clear and bright and certain. But the Olympics of 1940 never happened. Japan invaded China, and then the war in Europe began, and the Games were cancelled. By 1941, the entire world was burning. And Louis Zamperini's dreams of Olympic glory seemed like memories from another lifetime. On December 7th, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and like millions of other young American men, Louis enlisted. The runner became a soldier. The Army Air Corps trained him as a bombardier, and he found himself stationed in the Pacific, flying missions in a B-24 Liberator, a massive 4-engine bomber that carried 10 men, and enough explosives to level a city block. The B-24 was a remarkable machine, but it was also a coffin. The planes were pushed to their limits, flying long missions over vast stretches of ocean where mechanical failure meant certain death. There were no emergency landing strips in the middle of the Pacific. There was only water, endless and indifferent. Louis flew mission after mission, dropping bombs on Japanese installations, watching other planes go down in flames, attending memorial services for crews that simply disappeared. He was good at his job. He kept his fear under control. He trusted his crew and his pilot, Russell Phillips, a quiet man from Indiana who had steady hands and nerves of steel. In May of 1943, Louis and his crew were given what should have been a routine assignment. Another B-24 had gone down somewhere over the Pacific, and they were ordered to search for survivors. But there was a problem. Their usual plane was being repaired, and they were assigned a different aircraft, a battered B-24 known as the Green Hornet. The plane had a reputation. It was a musher, barely airworthy, with engines that sputtered and failed and equipment that constantly malfunctioned. The crew did not want to fly it, but orders were orders. And on May 27, 1943, Louis climbed aboard the Green Hornet, along with 10 other men and lifted off into the clear Pacific sky. 800 miles from base, the left engine failed. The plane lurched. Phillips fought with the controls, trying to compensate for the sudden loss of power. Then the second engine failed. The Green Hornet was going down, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The plane fell from the sky and hit the water with a force that shattered it into pieces. Louis remembered almost nothing of the crash itself. The impact, the terrible sound of metal tearing apart, the cold shock of the Pacific closing over his head. He was pulled under, tangled in wires, the wreckage of the plane dragging him down into the darkness. He fought free and kicked toward the surface, his lungs burning, certain he was about to die. When he broke through the surface and gasped for air, he saw debris scattered across the water. He saw 2 other men. Phillips, the pilot, was there, struggling to stay afloat, and Francis McNamara, a tail gunner everyone called Mac, was clinging to a piece of wreckage. 8 men had gone down with the Green Hornet. Only 3 had survived the crash. They found 2 small inflatable rafts among the floating debris and climbed aboard, their bodies shaking from shock and cold and the sudden realization of what had just happened. They were alone in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. No one knew exactly where they had gone down. The search radius would be enormous, and the chances of rescue were vanishingly small. The first day passed in a kind of numb disbelief. Surely someone would find them. Surely the search planes would spot the bright yellow rafts. But the second day came, and then the third, and the sky remained empty. The ocean stretched out around them in every direction, beautiful and terrible in its vastness. They had almost no supplies. A few chocolate bars, a couple of tins of water, some fishing line and hooks. It was not enough to sustain 3 men for more than a few days, and already they understood that rescue might take much longer than that. The sun rose each morning and beat down on them with an intensity that was almost unimaginable. It burned their skin, turned their lips into cracked and bleeding wounds, baked their brains inside their skulls. They had no shade, no protection. At night, the temperature dropped, and they shivered together on the rafts. Their bodies pressed close for warmth, watching the stars wheel overhead and wondering if anyone was looking for them. The Pacific was not the romantic paradise of travel posters. It was an instrument of torture, indifferent to human suffering, capable of killing with either fire or ice. The sharks came on the fourth day. Oceanic whitetips, some of them 12 feet long, drawn by the scent of blood and the vibrations of the rafts. They circled constantly, bumping against the rubber, testing it with their snouts, waiting for an opportunity. At night, Louis and the others would hit them with the oars, trying to drive them away, but the sharks were patient. They could wait. They had time. The men did not. Hunger became the dominant fact of their existence. The body is a machine that requires fuel, and when that fuel is absent, the machine begins to consume itself. Fat disappears first, then muscle. The mind starts to falter. Thoughts become fragmented. Hallucinations begin. On the 8th day, Mac panicked. He found the emergency rations while the others were sleeping and ate everything. All the chocolate, all the malted milk tablets, every precious calorie that might have kept them alive for another week. When Louis and Phillips woke and discovered what he had done, they were filled with a rage so pure it was almost murderous. They wanted to throw him off the raft. They wanted to let the sharks have him. But they did not. They controlled themselves. They forgave him. Because what else could they do? They were all dying together, and anger was a luxury they could not afford. They learned to catch rainwater when the occasional storm passed over. They spread out the canvas tarps and funneled every precious drop into their mouths. They learned to catch the birds that sometimes landed on the rafts, grabbing them with their bare hands and eating them raw, crunching through bones and feathers because their bodies were desperate for any source of protein. They caught small fish with hooks fashioned from the debris. They learned that survival requires the complete abandonment of everything civilized. Society teaches about being human. Dignity disappears. Shame disappears. There is only the animal drive to continue existing for one more day. Louis prayed. He had not been a religious man before the crash. His mother's Catholicism had never taken root in his rebellious heart. But on the raft, with death circling beneath him and the sun burning above, he found himself making a bargain with God. He promised that if he survived, he would dedicate his life to service. He would become a different man. He would repay this impossible salvation. It was a prayer born of desperation, but it was sincere. And in the years to come, that promise would haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. On the 27th day, Mac died. His body simply gave out. He had been the weakest of the three, and the guilt over eating the rations had broken something inside him. He stopped fighting. He lay in the raft with his eyes open, staring at the sky, and then one morning he was gone. Louis and Phillips held a brief service, saying what words they could remember, and then they slid his body into the water. The sharks took him almost immediately. Louis and Phillips were alone now, and the odds of survival had just become even worse. They talked to keep their minds from collapsing. They told each other stories from their childhoods. They described meals they would eat when they got home. They made elaborate plans about their futures. Phillips talked about his girlfriend. Louis talked about running again. They kept each other sane, or as close to sane as was possible under such circumstances. The human mind is not designed for this level of deprivation. It begins to fragment, to create false realities, to shut down non-essential functions in a desperate attempt to preserve the core of consciousness. On the 33rd day, they heard the sound of an aircraft engine. Hope surged through them with an intensity that was almost painful. They waved their arms, shouted themselves hoarse, tried everything to attract attention. The plane came closer, close enough that they could see the markings on its wings. But the markings were not American. They were Japanese. And the plane did not come to rescue them. It came to kill them. The machine guns opened fire, bullets stitching across the water, tearing through the rubber of the rafts. Louis and Phillips dove into the ocean as the plane made pass after pass, strafing them again and again. They stayed underwater as long as their starving lungs would allow, surfacing only to gasp for air before diving again. When the plane finally left, they climbed back onto the rafts and discovered that both were punctured and slowly deflating. They patched them as best they could with the repair kits. But Louis understood what this meant. They were in Japanese-controlled waters now. They were no longer waiting for rescue. They were waiting to be captured. On the 47th day, after more time adrift than any men in recorded history, they saw land. An atoll rose from the ocean, a thin strip of sand and palm trees that looked like paradise. They paddled toward it with the last reserves of their strength, their bodies skeletal, their minds barely functioning. When they reached the beach, they could not stand. They collapsed on the sand and lay there, feeling the earth beneath them for the first time in 7 weeks. Japanese soldiers found them within hours. Louis and Phillips were taken into custody, and as they were led away at gunpoint, Louis understood that one nightmare had simply been replaced by another. They had survived the impossible, but their suffering was only beginning. The island was called Kwajalein, and the Japanese soldiers who found them were not interested in mercy. Louis and Phillips were dragged from the beach and thrown into cells. They had survived 47 days on the ocean only to discover that their captivity would make them long for the simplicity of starvation and sharks. The guards beat them immediately, methodically, with a casual cruelty that suggested this was simply how prisoners were treated. There was no anger in it, no passion. It was policy. Louis learned quickly that the Geneva Convention was a fiction here, a set of civilized rules that applied only to civilized nations. And the Japanese military did not consider these rules binding when dealing with American prisoners. They were held at Kwajalein for several weeks in conditions that defied description. The cells were tiny, stifling, infested with insects. They were given almost no food, just enough to keep them barely alive. The guards would enter randomly to beat them, sometimes with fists, sometimes with clubs, sometimes with bamboo rods that left welts and cuts across their backs and legs. Louis weighed less than 80 pounds. His body was already wrecked from the raft, and now it was being systematically broken further. But something inside him refused to surrender. That same defiance that had made him steal pies as a child, that had made him run impossible races, that had kept him alive on the Pacific, it burned in him still. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Eventually, Louis and Phillips were transferred to a prisoner of war camp called Ofuna, located on the mainland of Japan. Ofuna was officially a secret interrogation center, which meant that the Red Cross did not know it existed and therefore could not inspect it or advocate for the prisoners held there. The Japanese could do whatever they wanted, and they did. Louis was placed in a cell with other captured airmen, and he learned the rules of this new existence very quickly. You bowed to every guard, no matter how junior. You followed orders instantly and without question. You endured the beatings without crying out, because crying out only made them beat you longer. You stole food whenever possible. You learned to become invisible, to avoid drawing attention, because attention always meant pain. But Louis Zamperini could not become invisible. He was too well known. The guards discovered that he had competed in the Berlin Olympics, and this made him a target. In the twisted logic of the camp, his athletic achievement was seen as a form of American arrogance that needed to be destroyed. They gave him the hardest labor. They reduced his food rations. They beat him more frequently than the other prisoners. And then, after several months at Ofuna, Louis was transferred again, this time to a camp called Amori, located on an island in Tokyo Bay. It was at Amori that Louis Zamperini met the man who would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. His name was Matsuhiro Watanabe, though the prisoners never used his real name. They called him the Bird. He was a corporal in the Imperial Japanese Army, a man of slight build and almost delicate features who carried within him a capacity for cruelty that was genuinely pathological. The Bird was not simply following orders when he tortured prisoners. He enjoyed it. He was obsessed with it. And from the moment he learned that Louis Zamperini had been an Olympic athlete, he made it his personal mission to destroy him. The Bird beat Louis almost every day. These were not impulsive acts of anger. They were calculated, theatrical performances of sadism. The Bird would force other prisoners to punch Louis in the face, one after another, creating a gauntlet of violence, while he stood, watching with an expression that resembled pleasure. He would withhold food from Louis for days, then place a bowl of rice in front of him and strike him across the face when he reached for it. He would make Louis clean the filthy latrines with his bare hands, and then beat him for not cleaning them properly. He seemed to understand instinctively where Louis was most vulnerable, not physically but psychologically, and he attacked those places with precision. The other prisoners watched this persecution with a mixture of horror and relief. Relief because the bird's attention was focused on Louis, which meant they were temporarily spared. Horror because they understood that any of them could become the next target. The bird's moods were unpredictable. He might walk past a prisoner one day, without notice, and beat him, unconscious the next for some imagined slight. There was no pattern to his violence, no way to avoid it through good behavior. The randomness was part of the torture. It kept everyone in a constant state of fear. Louis tried to understand what the bird wanted from him. Was it an apology? An admission of American guilt? Was it simply submission? The sight of the Olympic athlete reduced to a weeping, begging wreck? But Louis came to realize that the bird did not want any specific thing. What he wanted was the process itself. He wanted to break Louis' spirit not as a means to an end, but as an end in itself. The bird looked at Louis and saw something he could not tolerate: pride, dignity, an unbreakable core of selfhood, and he wanted to extinguish it. One winter day in 1945, the bird ordered Louis to pick up a heavy wooden beam, roughly 6 feet long and weighing perhaps 50 pounds. He told Louis to lift it over his head and hold it there. Louis lifted the beam. The minutes began to pass. His arms started to shake. The beam grew heavier with each second. The other prisoners gathered to watch, ordered there by the bird, forced to witness this contest of wills. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 15. Louis's arms were screaming. His shoulders felt like they were tearing apart. His vision began to blur. The pain was extraordinary, beyond anything the body should have to endure. But Louis did not drop the beam. The bird stood directly in front of him, waiting. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them. The bird was waiting for surrender. He was waiting for Louis to collapse, to weep, to beg for mercy. But Louis had survived 47 days on the Pacific Ocean. He had endured starvation and sharks and the certainty of death. He had watched his friend die and had continued living. Whatever the bird wanted from him, whatever piece of his soul the bird thought he could take, it was not available. Louis stared into the bird's eyes and did not look away. After 37 minutes, the bird lost his composure. He struck Louis across the face with his belt, knocking the beam from his hands. But both men knew who had won that battle. Louis had refused to be broken. In August of 1945, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. American planes flew over the prison camps, dropping supplies and messages, written in English telling the prisoners that the war was over, that they were free, that rescue was coming. The guards disappeared almost overnight. The bird fled into hiding, terrified of what the Allied forces would do to him when they arrived. Louis Zamperini walked out of a mori weighing less than 100 pounds. His body covered in scars, his mind damaged in ways he did not yet understand. He had survived. He was going home. The journey back to America took weeks. Louis was processed through military hospitals, examined by doctors who marveled at his condition, asked endless questions by intelligence officers who wanted to document the atrocities committed in the camps. He was given clean clothes and hot food and a bed with sheets, luxuries that felt almost obscene after years of deprivation. He sent a telegram to his family, and when he finally arrived in California in October of 1945, they were waiting for him. His mother wept when she saw him. His father, that stern Italian immigrant who had tried to discipline the wildness out of his son, embraced him and could not let go. Louis was home. He had survived the impossible. The nightmare was over. Except it was not over. It had only changed form. Every night, Louis dreamed of the bird. He would fall asleep in his comfortable bed in his parents' house, and within minutes he would be back at a mori. He would see that face. He would feel the blows. He would hear that voice. He would wake up gasping, his body drenched in sweat. his hands clenched into fists, ready to fight an enemy who was not there. The nightmares came every single night without exception. They were as reliable as sunrise, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. He tried to resume a normal life. He met a young woman named Cynthia Applewhite at a beach one afternoon, and she was beautiful and kind and saw in him something worth loving. They married in 1946, and Louis tried to be the man she deserved. But the war had followed him home in ways that no one around him could understand. The military had no framework for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They told veterans to be strong, to move forward, to put the war behind them. But you cannot put such things behind you when they live inside your skull, when they wait for you every time you close your eyes. Louis began to drink. At first, it was just a way to quiet the memories, to blur the edges of the nightmares. A few drinks before bed meant he might sleep for a few hours before the bird appeared. But the drinking escalated. A few drinks became a bottle. One bottle became two. The alcohol became the only thing that made life bearable. And soon Louis was drinking from morning until night, stumbling through his days in a fog, watching his marriage crumble. Cynthia begged him to stop. She threatened to leave. She tried everything she could think of to reach the man she had married. But that man seemed to have disappeared entirely, replaced by someone haunted and angry and unreachable. Louis became obsessed with revenge. He fantasized constantly about returning to Japan and finding the bird and killing him with his bare hands. He planned it in detail. He imagined exactly how he would do it. The look on the bird's face when he realized who had come for him. The feeling of his hands closing around that throat. The fantasy was the only thing that brought him any peace. It gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to continue living. He told Cynthia about his plans. He told her he was going to Japan to kill the man who had tortured him. And she listened in horror as her husband described acts of violence, with a calmness that was more terrifying than rage. By 1949, their marriage was ending. Cynthia had given birth to their daughter. But even fatherhood could not pull Louis back from the abyss. He was a prisoner again, not in a Japanese camp but in his own mind. And this was a battle he did not know how to fight. The physical torture had ended, but the psychological torture continued every single day. He was drinking himself to death, and everyone around him could see it. His family was desperate. His friends did not know what to do. Cynthia prepared to file for divorce. Then, in the fall of 1949, a young preacher named Billy Graham came to Los Angeles. He set up a massive tent in a downtown parking lot and began holding revival meetings. Thousands of people came to hear him speak. Cynthia went to one of the meetings and came home changed. She told Louis that he needed to come with her, that this preacher was saying things that might help him. Louis refused. He wanted nothing to do with God or church or any of it. He was angry at God for what had happened to him, angry that his prayers on the raft had been answered with 2 years of torture. But Cynthia was insistent. She told him that if he did not come to at least one meeting, she was leaving him and taking their daughter. So Louis went. He sat in the back of that tent, drunk and furious, determined not to listen. Billy Graham was young, only 30 years old, but he spoke with an authority that cut through Louis's defenses. Graham talked about suffering. He talked about men who had been through war and come home broken. He talked about the idea that God could take a shattered life and make it whole again. He talked about forgiveness, not as a weakness but as the only path to freedom. And then he said something that struck Louis like a physical blow. He said that carrying hatred was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Louis remembered the raft. He remembered the prayer he had made on the 47th day, the bargain he had struck with God. If you save me, I will serve you for the rest of my life. He had survived. He had been saved from the ocean and from the camps and from death itself. And he had not kept his promise. He had spent 4 years drinking and planning murder and allowing the bird to continue torturing him from thousands of miles away. The bird did not need to be present to destroy Louis. Louis was doing that himself. That night, Louis Zamperini walked to the front of the tent. He knelt down and gave his life to Christ. He went home and poured every bottle of alcohol in the house down the drain. And that night, for the first time in 4 years, he slept through until morning without dreaming of the bird. The Nightmares did not disappear entirely. They would return occasionally for the rest of his life, but their power over him was broken. He had found something stronger than hatred. He had found forgiveness. But forgiveness was not just a feeling. It required action. In 1950, Louis returned to Japan. He did not go for revenge. He went to visit the prison camps where he had been held and to meet with his former guards. One by one, he found the men who had beaten him, starved him, tortured him. And one by one, he told them that he forgave them. Some of them wept. Some of them could not understand why this American had come back to offer them peace instead of vengeance. Louis explained that holding on to hatred had nearly destroyed him, and that forgiveness was not about excusing what they had done. It was about freeing himself from the prison of bitterness. He tried to find the bird. He wanted to forgive him too. Wanted to look into those eyes one more time and tell him that the torture was over. That Louis was no longer his victim. But Matsuhiro Watanabe was in hiding. Too ashamed or too afraid to face the men he had brutalized. They never met again. The bird lived in obscurity until 2003, dying at the age of 97 without ever expressing remorse for what he had done. But Louis forgave him anyway. He said that forgiveness was not dependent on the other person's response. It was a gift you gave yourself. Louis Zamperini lived to be 97 years old. He spent the remaining 65 years of his life telling his story. Not to glorify himself, but to give hope to others who were suffering. He started a camp for troubled boys, hoping to do for them what his brother, Pete, had done for him so many years ago on that high school track. He spoke at schools and churches and military bases. He met with other veterans who were struggling with their own demons and told them that healing was possible, that the nightmares did not have to win. He never stopped running. Even as his body aged, he continued to push himself, to test the limits of what was possible. At 80 years old, he took up skateboarding, riding through the streets of California with the same reckless joy he had shown as a child. In 1998, he was invited to carry the Olympic torch through Nagano, Japan, as part of the Winter Olympics. He ran past the very site where he had been imprisoned, and as he ran, tears streamed down his face. They were not tears of bitterness or pain. They were tears of gratitude for having lived long enough to complete the circle, to transform suffering into purpose. What do we take from the story of Louis Zamperini? Perhaps this, that the human spirit possesses reserves of strength we cannot imagine until we are forced to access them. That survival is not merely a physical act but a choice we make every single day to continue fighting when surrender would be easier. Louis survived the ocean not because he was stronger than other men but because he refused to accept death as inevitable. He survived the camps not because the torture was bearable but because he found something inside himself that the bird could not touch. And he survived the war at home not through his own willpower, but by finally admitting that he needed help. That forgiveness was not weakness, but the hardest and most courageous act a human being can perform. His story reminds us that we are all more resilient than we believe ourselves to be. We carry within us the capacity to endure extraordinary suffering and to emerge from that suffering not destroyed but transformed. But it also reminds us that true strength is not found in vengeance or in carrying our wounds like badges of honor. True strength is found in letting go, in refusing to allow those who have hurt us to continue hurting us through our own bitterness and rage. Louis Zamperini spent 4 years as a prisoner of war in Japan. He spent 4 more years as a prisoner of his own hatred. And he spent the final 65 years of his life as a free man. Not because his circumstances changed but because he chose freedom over captivity. Louis Zamperini died on July 2, 2014, in Los Angeles, surrounded by his family. He had kept the promise he made on that raft in the Pacific. He had served. He had given his life meaning beyond survival. And in the end, he had discovered what all of us spend our lives searching for: the peace that comes not from the absence of suffering but from the refusal to let suffering define who we are. His body was buried, but his story lives on, a testament to the unbreakable nature of the human spirit when it is directed, not toward destruction but toward grace.